Hello and welcome to Dreams of the Past. Tonight, close your eyes and picture this. A city that floats. A city where streets are made of water and the stars above have twins below, shimmering on a lake that stretches as far as the eye can see. This isn't Venice, though it could have been its rival. This was Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec world, the jewel of the Valley of Mexico, a city so magnificent that when the Spaniards first saw it, they thought they were dreaming. Imagine it at night. Temples glowing with torchlight, the smell of flowers and incense drifting across the water, the sound of oars dipping in rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing through the darkness. How did a people with no metal tools, no horses, and no wheels build all this? Why did they choose to build their capital on a lake in the first place? And how did a city so powerful, so alive, end in silence only a few years later? Tonight we'll begin that journey, from the height of a miracle to its last sunset. But before we drift any further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's a simple way to keep the channel going, and it really does mean a lot to me. I'm also always curious. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment and let me know. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the day fade away, and let's travel back to a time of stone temples, moonlit waters, and fading empires. The Spanish set eyes on Tenochtitlan in 1519. It was already ancient in its soul. Imagine more than 200,000 people living in harmony with a lake. No cars, no iron, no beasts of burden. Just canoes gliding through waterways lined with white stone. The city sat on a series of islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Causeways connected it to the mainland. Long, straight roads that seemed to cut through clouds reflected on the surface. Along those roads, merchants carried cacao beans, obsidian blades, and tropical feathers worth more than gold. And when you entered the city, it must have taken your breath away. The markets were alive with colour and scent. Chilies, flowers, perfumes, and roasted corn. The air was heavy with incense, and above it all rose temples painted in bright reds and whites, glimmering under the sun by day and glowing by torchlight at night. Even the gardens floated, man-made islands called chinampas. Picture this, narrow strips of earth anchored by reeds, bursting with maize, beans, squash, and flowers. Farmers paddled quietly between them at dawn. From above, it looked like the lake itself had decided to bloom. Everywhere life was balance. Between earth and water, day and night, war and peace. Children played by the canals. Nobles glided past in canoes decorated with bright banners. Fishermen set their nets by moonlight, and priests watched the stars to mark the calendar of gods. The people here didn't just live on water, they belonged to it. The Aztecs, or Mexica as they called themselves, saw the lake as both protector and provider. It was sacred. It fed them, carried them, and mirrored the heavens they worshipped. And maybe that's why the city felt otherworldly, because it was built with both faith and engineering that defied common sense. To keep the city from flooding, they built dams. To get fresh water, they built aqueducts. And to reach the gods, they built pyramids so tall they looked like stairways to the sun. Standing on the top of the Templo Mayor, you could see the whole valley, the mountains circling like silent guardians, the lake glowing beneath, and the people below moving like rivers of colour. And yet, for all its beauty, something deeper pulsed beneath it. A quiet fear. Because this miracle of a city was not built on peace. It was built on conquest, on tribute, on faith, and on blood. Every drumbeat in Tenochtitlan echoed with meaning. Every festival celebrated both life and death. The Aztecs believed the sun itself would die without human sacrifice, that the gods had fed their own hearts to create the world, and humans must repay that debt every day. It sounds brutal to us sitting in comfort centuries later. But to them it wasn't cruelty, it was cosmic responsibility. To keep the universe in balance, someone had to bleed, and that someone was honoured. So at sunrise, the city was filled with music, chanting, the smoke of copal incense. At sunset, the temples glowed like embers, and through it all, life continued. Merchants trading, children laughing, lovers meeting by the water. It's easy to see only the rituals and forget the humanity, the laughter, the art, the poetry. The Aztecs loved poetry, by the way. They called it flower and song, beauty created to touch eternity. One poet once wrote, "We only borrow this earth, we are here for a short time." Strange, isn't it? Even then, they knew how fragile it all was, and maybe deep down, they sensed change coming. The prophecies spoke of omens, fire in the sky, voices in the wind, temples trembling at night. Some said the gods were warning them, others said it was nonsense. But fear has a way of whispering louder than reason. And far beyond the horizon, something was stirring. Sails, white ghostly shapes gliding across an ocean no Aztec had ever seen. But that's for another night. For now we leave Tenochtitlan in peace. Still shining, still alive. Its canals reflect the moon. Its markets are closing. Somewhere a child falls asleep to the sound of water lapping against the walls of stone. They don't yet know that their city, their whole world, stands on the edge of twilight. Next time we'll step into that twilight. We'll meet the gods who fed on hearts, and the faith that kept the sun alive. Do you ever wonder what people 1,000 years ago believed kept the world alive? Not electricity, not Wi-Fi, not caffeine. Though, let's be honest, that's a close second. No, for the Aztecs, the universe itself ran on something far older and far darker. They believed the sun needed to be fed, not with fuel, but with hearts. And to them that wasn't horror. That was duty. Because if the sun ever stopped rising, everything, light, crops, people, even the gods, would vanish into endless night. So tonight let's wander into the temples of Tenochtitlan, where faith and fear dance together. Let's meet the gods who fed on hearts. The Mexica saw their world as a gift paid for in blood. According to their creation story, the gods had sacrificed themselves to make the world move. One by one, they threw their divine bodies into the fire so the sun could rise. It's a wild image, gods literally jumping into a cosmic bonfire so humans could have morning light. And after that, well, the bill had to be paid. Humans, they believed, were living on borrowed sunlight. Every dawn was proof that someone, somewhere, had offered their heart to keep the fire burning. So when we picture an Aztec ceremony, it's easy to see only the blade and the blood. But what we often miss is what they saw. Gratitude. Awe. A promise kept between gods and mortals. In a strange way, it wasn't cruelty. It was cosmic maintenance. Like paying the universe's electric bill, except, slightly more dramatic. Their gods weren't just names in myths. They were neighbours, bosses, weather patterns, and cosmic accountants all rolled into one. At the top sat Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of the sun and war. He wasn't peaceful. Every day he battled the forces of darkness across the sky, and every night he risked being swallowed forever. So his people fought too, not for territory, but for hearts. When Aztec warriors captured enemies, they weren't just expanding an empire, they were collecting sunlight for tomorrow. Beside Huitzilopochtli was Tlaloc, the rain god, who could bless or destroy with equal mood swings. Farmers left offerings of maize, shells, and even children, hoping he'd send rain instead of storms. Then there was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Wise, gentle, the bringer of art and learning. He was a god who, according to legend, hated sacrifice. A quiet rebel in a pantheon of warriors, see? Even the gods didn't all agree. And maybe that's what made the Aztec world so human, full of conflict, compromise, and contradictions. Every day began with sound, the beating of drums from the temples. The people would rise, light incense, and thank the sun for coming back. Then they'd go about their lives, farmers to the chinampas, traders to the markets, priests to the altars. From the outside, the city was peaceful, almost serene. But up the Great Pyramid, rituals continued. Now, this is where history books love to get dramatic. Yes, sacrifices happened. Yes, they were bloody. But the numbers you sometimes hear, thousands a day, are probably exaggerations told later by shocked Europeans. For the Aztecs, the act wasn't about cruelty. It was about rhythm, like the rising and setting of the sun itself. The heart was seen as the seat of life, the vessel of divine fire. To offer it was to return a spark to the cosmos. Strange logic to us, yes, but to them it was the highest honour. And not everyone's sacrifice was forced. Some volunteered. Warriors who believed that dying on the pyramid steps meant rebirth as a hummingbird following the sun. Imagine that. Death not as loss but as migration. Not an ending, just a change of wings. Religion wasn't a Sunday thing in Tenochtitlan. It was everything, from cooking to farming to war. If the rain was late, people prayed to Tlaloc. If the sun rose beautifully, they thanked Huitzilopochtli. If trade went well, they thanked Quetzalcoatl. Even time itself was sacred. Their calendar was an intricate dance of gods and cycles. 260 sacred days, 365 solar ones, always turning like gears in a divine clock. And when those cycles aligned, when the calendars reset, they performed the new fire ceremony. Picture this: the entire valley in darkness, every fire extinguished, people waiting in silence under the stars. Then, on a mountaintop, priests lit a new flame in the chest of a sacrificed warrior. If the fire caught, the world would continue for another 52 years. If not, well, that was the apocalypse. Talk about pressure at work. But the flame always caught, and the people would light their torches from it, one by one, until the whole valley shimmered again. From fear to joy, darkness to dawn, their religion was their heartbeat. By now you can probably sense it, this mix of devotion and dread that defined the Aztec world. They lived in constant awareness that everything beautiful was temporary. Even gods could die, even suns could fall, and that made every festival, every sunrise, every poem more precious. Because to believe your world hangs by a thread makes you love it harder. There's a quiet lesson there, even for us. We might not sacrifice hearts to keep the sun burning, but we all have our small rituals, things we do to keep our world spinning. A morning coffee, a bedtime story, a promise kept. The Aztecs did theirs on a grander scale, sure, but maybe deep down it came from the same human place, that fear of losing what we love. And as their empire grew, so did their hunger, not just for sacrifice, but for tribute, for trade, for glory. The faith that once held them together began to stretch thin under the weight of power. In the next chapter, we'll drift deeper into that empire. How it rose, ruled, and sowed the seeds of its own undoing. For now the drums fade, the fires dim, and the lake of Tenochtitlan glows softly under starlight. The gods are fed for another day. Imagine ruling a world held together by gifts, fear, and favours. Not with emails or treaties, but with cacao beans, feathers, and gold dust carried across hundreds of miles by foot. That was the Aztec Empire, a network of cities that didn't just obey, they paid tribute. Every loaf of bread, every cloak, every drop of honey told a story of power flowing toward one shining city in the middle of a lake. And at the heart of it all was Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the valley, the collector of the world. The Mexica weren't born kings. They started as wanderers, exiles drifting through central Mexico, unwelcome, hungry, and looking for a home. Legend says their god, Huitzilopochtli, gave them a sign. They would find their destiny where an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. And one day they saw it, right there on a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Most people would have said, nope, too wet. But the Mexica looked at that soggy patch of mud and said, perfect. They built rafts of reeds, anchored them with stakes, and started laying down stones. Slowly, an island grew, then a city, then an empire. There's something quietly beautiful about that. They took the one place no one wanted and turned it into the centre of the world. Power, though, needs maintenance, and armies are expensive. So the Aztecs created a system that was both clever and terrifying. Tribute. Every conquered city-state, or altepetl, had to send regular offerings to Tenochtitlan. Not just coins. They didn't use those. But goods, labour, and people. Feathers from the tropics, chocolate from the south, cotton, gold, obsidian blades, and sometimes captives. The capital turned into a living market of tribute. Imagine streets lined with warehouses overflowing with exotic goods, parrots squawking in cages, jaguar pelts drying in the sun, shimmering turquoise jewellery waiting to be carved. Tribute wasn't just wealth. It was a message, a constant reminder that Tenochtitlan was the beating heart, and everyone else was just a vein. The Aztecs didn't rule like European monarchs. They didn't send governors or plant flags everywhere. They let the local rulers stay, as long as the goods kept flowing and nobody rebelled. So the empire wasn't really a country. It was a web of promises, threats, and payments, held together by the unspoken rule. Keep the gods happy. Keep the Mexica happy. But like any web, it was fragile. Pull one strand too tight, and something would snap. If you visited Tlatelolco, the twin city of Tenochtitlan. On a market day, you'd probably lose your mind. It was massive. Some Spanish visitors later said it was bigger than anything in Europe. Tens of thousands of people bartering. Salt from the coasts, obsidian from the mountains, corn from the valleys. There were sections for everything. Textiles here, animals there, and of course, the food court. Tamales, chili stews, fresh tortillas made right on the spot. The air was thick with spice and noise. But unlike most markets, there were no coins clinking. Everything was done with barter and cacao beans. And if you cheated, don't even think about it. The market had its own judges, standing right there among the stalls. It was order inside chaos, the perfect mirror of Aztec society. But for all the splendour, there was tension. Every bag of grain sent to the capital meant one less meal in the provinces. Every feather cloak given as tribute was a reminder of subservience. Some cities resented Tenochtitlan deeply. They smiled when the collectors came, then muttered curses when they left. And when the Mexica demanded soldiers for their next war, those cities marched, but not always willingly. Underneath the empire's glittering surface was a quiet murmur of rebellion, a feeling that one day the balance would break. For young Aztec men, war wasn't just glory, it was a path to social climbing. Capture an enemy alive, and you might rise in rank, gain land, maybe even a feathered cloak. Kill him, though. And it didn't count. They didn't fight to destroy, they fought to sustain. Wars were sacred hunts for prisoners, hearts to feed the sun. They even had ritualized battles called flower wars, agreed upon fights with rival cities to capture victims for sacrifice. It sounds grim, but to them it was balance in motion. The gods needed energy, and the warriors provided it. Still, each of these wars also spread fear and resentment. Some conquered peoples began to see Tenochtitlan not as a holy capital, but as a monster that would never stop feeding. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan glittered like a dream. Its markets were rich, its armies undefeated, its canals alive with colour. From the top of the temples, priests could see smoke rising from 100 tribute cities. From the mainland, every road led to the lake, to the heart of empire. But like all things that shine too brightly, it couldn't last. Because far across the sea, another empire had risen, hungry for gold, for souls, for conquest. And when those worlds collided, only one would survive. For now, though, the city still hums. The lake still glows beneath the sun. Boats slide along the canals carrying maize, flowers and tribute, unaware that the wind already carries whispers of strangers. In the next chapter, we'll follow those whispers. Omens in the sky, fear in the temples, and the first rumours of pale men arriving from the east. Until then, rest easy in the city that believed it could never fall. A city of water. And pride. It began with whispers. Not armies, not sails, not swords. Just stories drifting across the mountains like smoke. Some said pale men had arrived on the eastern shores. Men whose skin shone like moonlight. Men who rode giant deer. Creatures taller than two men. Men who spat fire from their hands and carried thunder in tubes of wood. At first, nobody believed it. It sounded like something out of a drunk poet's dream. But in the palaces of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma listened, and he did not laugh, because he had been dreaming too. Moctezuma II, emperor, priest, warrior, philosopher. To his people he was both man and bridge to the gods. But by the early 1500s he was uneasy. Strange signs had filled the skies. A comet streaking across the heavens, blazing like fire. Temples struck by lightning. A lake boiling without wind. Even the common people whispered that the gods were sending omens. And to the Aztecs, omens weren't coincidences. They were messages. Every ripple on the water, every bird that flew the wrong way, every sudden eclipse. It all meant something. Moctezuma's priests told him the world might be nearing the end of its cycle, that the fifth sun, the current age of humanity, was growing weak, and that a god might soon return. You remember Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the gentle god of wisdom and creation. Long ago, legend said he left the Valley of Mexico, sailing east on a raft of serpents. Before he left, he promised to return one day, bringing peace or judgment. So when the first reports came of pale-skinned strangers arriving from the east, some wondered, was this the prophecy coming true? Moctezuma couldn't ignore it. He spent sleepless nights consulting priests, diviners, and even his personal sorcerers. But their answers were confusing. Some said the strangers were gods, others said they were demons, and one, very quietly, said they were just men, but men who would change the world. The first concrete news came from the coast. Messengers returned breathless from the Gulf of Mexico. They said the strangers had landed, about 100 of them. Their leader's name, Cortez. They brought beasts never seen before. Horses, tall and muscular, with eyes that glowed in firelight, and weapons that roared like thunder and spat smoke. The messengers spoke of shimmering armour that reflected the sun, of strange ships taller than temples, and of banners painted with crosses instead of gods. When Moctezuma heard, he fell silent. He ordered gifts to be sent to the strangers, jewels, gold and food, perhaps to welcome them, or to keep them away. But we all know how humans work. Sometimes the fastest way to draw attention is to show someone what they don't yet have. To the Aztecs, these strangers were impossible to understand. They didn't follow the sacred calendars. They didn't speak of the gods. They didn't even seem to age properly under the sun. Their pale skin burned instead of darkening. Everything about them felt wrong. And for Moctezuma, it wasn't just curiosity. It was terror. Because what if this was Quetzalcoatl returning? What if this was Judgment Day? He began to withdraw into his palace more often, leaving decisions to his counselors, sending spies disguised as traders to watch the strangers from afar. Even in his dreams he saw omens, a burning sky, a collapsing temple, a voice whispering from across the water. Your city is built on borrowed time. While Moctezuma wrestled with doubt, the people of Tenochtitlan had their own theories. Some laughed off the rumours, some were afraid, and some were angry. They'd seen this before. Strangers, troublemakers, traders with bad manners. But never anything like this. Still, daily life went on. The markets opened. Children played by the canals. The sun rose. The empire looked as stable as ever. But whispers are like cracks in a dam. Invisible at first, then unstoppable. Across the provinces, fear spread faster than orders. The stories grew stranger with each telling. Some said the newcomers were immune to arrows. Others said they turned enemies to stone. And one rumour even claimed they carried diseases that killed without wounds. To a people who measured their lives in cycles and prophecies, these stories weren't just gossip. They were evidence that the gods had turned the page. And far away, on the humid coast of Veracruz, Cortes and his small army were preparing to march inland. They didn't yet know how vast the empire ahead was. They didn't know that the city they'd heard of, the one on the lake, was unlike anything they could imagine. They only knew one thing: the locals had gold, lots of it. And if there's one thing history never runs out of, it's people who see gold and start thinking they're invincible. So as the Spaniards began their slow climb through mountains and jungle, they left behind a wake of awe and fear. Each village they passed through sent word ahead: the gods are coming. And by the time they reached the edge of the valley, the rumour had become prophecy. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma's anxiety turned to obsession. He began sending more gifts, hoping perhaps that generosity could stop destiny. Gold discs shaped like the sun, silver shaped like the moon, feathered cloaks fit for divine shoulders. But each gift only fueled Cortes' desire to reach the source, and Moctezuma's every gesture, meant to appease, only made the Spaniards believe he was weak. It's tragic, really. Two worlds misunderstanding each other, step by step, each one convinced they were playing the smarter game. Yiwa. The winds over the lake begin to change. The temples cast long shadows at dusk. And somewhere in the east, under a crimson sky, a column of armoured men and native allies starts the long road toward the city of water. Next time, we'll walk with them, through jungles, mountains, and fear, to the gates of Tenochtitlan itself. For now, the city still sleeps in peace. The people laugh, the priests pray, and far beyond the horizon, the first ripples of history's greatest meeting are already moving across the lake. Imagine seeing something so strange. You couldn't tell if it was real or divine. On the horizon, shapes rising out of the mist. Not clouds, not mountains, but floating towers, taller than temples, draped with white wings. To the people watching from the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, it looked like the sea itself had given birth to monsters. And from those monsters came men, pale, bearded, wrapped in metal, their faces hidden behind shining helmets. The year was 1519. The strangers had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. When Hernán Cortés stepped onto the sands of Veracruz, he probably didn't think of himself as a villain. He thought of himself as an explorer, maybe even a hero, bringing faith, order, and, let's be honest, looking for gold. Behind him stood about 500 soldiers, a few cannon, some priests, and a handful of horses that looked like mythical beasts to the locals. The Totonac people, who lived nearby, came to see these newcomers. They had never seen men with metal skin, never heard thunder come from their hands. And when they saw the Spaniards kneel before their cross and pray, they must have thought, these are not men, these are gods. But the funny thing about gods, they rarely stay divine for long. When Moctezuma heard of the newcomers, he sent envoys bearing gifts, gold, feathers, and delicate masks. It was meant as diplomacy, maybe even a bribe to keep them at a safe distance. But to Cortés it was confirmation. The land was rich, the stories were true, and these gods were very, very human after all, with human greed. When the messengers returned and described the city on the lake, a city of shining towers, water streets and markets beyond imagination, Cortés made up his mind. He would go there. He would see Tenochtitlan with his own eyes. Along the way, Cortés gained an ally. One history often calls La Malinche, though her true name was Malintzin. She had been given to him as part of a peace offering, a woman fluent in several native languages. With her, Cortés could finally speak to the people he met. Through her translations, words became bridges, and sometimes traps. It's easy to paint her as a traitor, but it's not that simple. Imagine being caught between two empires, one collapsing, the other rising, and realizing your voice could shape the fate of both. Malintzin wasn't just a translator, she was the interpreter of an apocalypse. As Cortés marched inland, he met the powerful city-state of Tlaxcala. Fierce enemies of the Aztecs, the Tlaxcalans hated Tenochtitlan's tribute collectors, its taxes, its demands. They'd fought the Mexica for generations. So when Cortés arrived, they attacked at first. But after seeing the strange weapons and armour of the Spaniards, they switched from enemies to allies. Together they formed an uneasy partnership, not born of trust but of shared hatred. To the Tlaxcalans, these foreigners were tools to destroy their oppressors. To Cortés, they were an army he could never have built alone. History loves irony, because without the Tlaxcalans, the conquest would never have happened. The road to Tenochtitlan wound through misty valleys and snow-capped volcanoes. It was cold, silent and sacred. Every village they passed sent gifts or warnings ahead. At night, fires flickered in the distance. Watchers from the Empire keeping track of the strangers' advance. Imagine that march. The clank of metal armour in the dark, the steady hooves of horses, creatures the locals thought were one being with their riders, the soft murmur of prayers in Spanish, mixing with Nahuatl, whispers in the wind. Every step closer to the valley felt like walking into prophecy. When the Spaniards finally reached the ridge overlooking the Valley of Mexico, they stopped and stared in awe. Below them spread a glittering lake, and rising from its centre, connected by long white causeways, was Tenochtitlan. Floating, shining, alive. Bernal Diaz, one of Cortés's soldiers, later wrote that they thought it was a dream, a vision from another world. The temples rose high above the water, the streets shimmered, the air carried the scent of flowers and smoke. Even the Spaniards, hardened soldiers, fell silent. They had seen cities before, but never one that looked like it had been carved from light. Word reached Moctezuma that the strangers had arrived at the edge of his empire. He faced an impossible choice: attack and risk offending a god, or welcome them and risk doom. He chose the latter. He sent emissaries to greet Cortés, bringing gifts, food, jewels, and golden ornaments shaped like the sun. The Spaniards' eyes widened. You could almost hear Cortés whisper, "We've come to the right place." Moctezuma, meanwhile, prayed that kindness could buy peace, but peace was never what the newcomers had come for, and so the meeting of worlds moved closer, step by step. The lake shimmered beneath the sun, as if reflecting both futures, one of glory, one of ruin. Cortés marched on, guided by ambition and faith. Moctezuma waited, guided by prophecy and fear. Neither understood the other, and yet in their misunderstanding, destiny found its path. Two worlds were about to shake hands, and history would never sleep again. The drums of Tenochtitlan echo across the water, The markets close. The lake glows under the last light of day. Tomorrow the strangers will enter the city of water and stone. Tomorrow gods will meet gods. Or so they believe. But gold glitters for everyone differently, and under that golden shimmer shadows are beginning to stir. Next time, we'll walk with them through those shining gates, to the moment when awe turns into ambition and friendship begins to crack. They say money talks, but gold sings. And when that song reached the ears of the Spaniards, it drowned out everything else. Reason, fear, even faith. It started with a gift, a gesture meant to welcome, or to warn. But as history has shown us again and again, when one world offers gold, the other usually comes to take it. This is the story of the gift of gold. Moctezuma still hadn't seen the strangers himself, but he knew they were coming. So, as a good host, or perhaps as a cautious one, he sent them presents. The finest work his artisans could make. Gold discs shaped like the sun, silver moons, masks of jade and turquoise, and feathered cloaks that shimmered like rainbows when the light hit them. To Moctezuma, it was diplomacy, a way of saying, "We see you, we honour you. Please, stay there." To Cortés and his men, it was something else entirely. Proof that the rumours were true. This was a land paved in treasure. When the gifts arrived, Cortés didn't hide his reaction. He smiled, that slow, dangerous smile of someone who's already imagining the next shipment. And the one after that. His men crowded around the chests, running their fingers over the gold. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Others just stared, their eyes wide with hunger. One soldier later wrote, "When we saw the gold, it was as if our hearts had been lifted from our chests." Lifted, maybe. But not in a good way, because from that moment they weren't explorers anymore. They were miners of destiny. It's strange to think how quickly two intelligent civilizations can misunderstand each other. Moctezuma's message had layers: humility, ritual, maybe even fear. In his mind, generosity showed strength. But to the Spaniards, it showed weakness. Cortés thought the emperor was paying tribute, that this entire empire was just waiting to be claimed. A gold-covered invitation, signed by the gods themselves. He wrote to his king, describing a land so rich the streets are lined with treasure. A small exaggeration, maybe, but one that would soon feed an empire of its own. With every mile toward Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards' greed grew louder than their caution. Even their allies, the Tlaxcalans, warned them, "The Mexica are powerful. Their city is like no other." But Cortés was no longer listening. He saw destiny written in gold, and so he pressed on, across valleys, rivers, and the long white causeways leading to the city of the lake. Every step echoed with the clink of armour and the weight of ambition. Behind them, priests carried crosses. Beside them, native allies whispered prayers. And ahead of them, Tenochtitlan shimmered like a mirage made real. When the Spaniards finally entered the city, the people lined the streets in silence. Flower petals rained from balconies. Musicians played flutes and drums that sounded like soft thunder over water. And then, there he was. Moctezuma. Tall, elegant, calm, wearing a cloak woven with gold and feathers finer than silk. Beside him, attendants held canopies to shield him from the sun. When he met Cortés, both men hesitated. Two worlds paused, measuring each other, one through prophecy, the other through greed. They exchanged gifts. They exchanged smiles. And behind those smiles, they both wondered the same thing. What does the other truly want? Moctezuma invited the Spaniards to stay in one of his palaces, a grand compound filled with courtyards, gardens, and carved stone halls. Every day, new food arrived: turkey, fish, fruit, chocolate. Enough to feed an army. And yet, the visitors barely noticed. Their eyes were fixed on the walls, on the golden ornaments, on the jade figurines, on the treasures that gleamed from every corner. To them, this wasn't hospitality. It was confirmation. They had found the heart of a golden empire. Cortés began to take notes. How many people lived in the city, where the temples stood? Which buildings looked richest? He smiled politely to Moctezuma by day, and plotted by night. For a brief moment, the illusion held. The Spaniards behaved as guests. They attended ceremonies, observed rituals, marvelled at the city's beauty. Moctezuma treated them like divine visitors, He gave them food, gifts, even women to serve them. But outside the palace, the people were restless. They didn't like these pale strangers walking freely through sacred places, touching holy relics, staring too long at their idols. And the more gifts Moctezuma gave, the angrier they became, because gifts meant fear, and fear was not fitting for an emperor. Inside the palace, the Spaniards melted down the gold they'd been given, not out of need, but to weigh it, to calculate it, to divide it in their minds before it was even theirs. That's the thing about gold, it's beautiful, but it never comes without a curse. As the furnaces burned and the gold turned to liquid, a new kind of heat filled the air. Suspicion, envy, temptation. Every shimmer of molten light reflected a truth neither side wanted to admit. They couldn't both exist here. One world would consume the other. Yomai. Outside, the city still glowed on the water. From the temple tops, priests watched torches flicker in the night, tiny flames unaware of the storm they'd soon face. In the palace, Cortés and Moctezuma stood beneath the same ceiling, smiling through silence. Gold glittered between them, beautiful, blinding, and deadly. Next time, the gates of Tenochtitlan open wider. The strangers settle in, and the city of water welcomes the Iron Men. Imagine standing on the white causeway leading into the heart of Tenochtitlan. The air smells of flowers and incense. The water gleams under the morning sun, and in the distance the city rises like a mirage. Temples, towers, and gardens floating between the clouds and the lake. Now imagine that into this dream. Walkmen made of iron, boots clanging on stone, banners snapping in the wind, horses snorting, creatures the locals still can't quite believe are real. That was the day the city of water welcomed the Iron Men. Cortés and his army, Spanish soldiers, native allies and translators, marched in a long glittering line across the causeway. The lake stretched endlessly on both sides, dotted with canoes filled with curious onlookers. Some of the Mexica stared in silence, some whispered prayers, some quietly spat into the water for luck. Above the city, drums echoed, not war drums, ceremonial ones. The rhythm of welcome, not warning. When the procession reached the city gates, the smell of flowers thickened. Priests burned incense and nobles laid out petals for the newcomers to walk on. Everywhere you looked, colour, music, movement. It was as if the entire city had come to see a legend arrive. And perhaps in their eyes it truly was. In the centre of the causeway stood Moctezuma, surrounded by attendants, each one holding a canopy of shimmering feathers and gold. The emperor himself didn't move at first. He waited, calm and still, like a statue carved from sunlit stone. When Cortés approached, both men hesitated. Two worlds meeting in silence. Cortés tried to speak, but his words were translated twice. Once by Aguilar, then by Malintzin. Moctezuma listened, nodded slowly, then placed a necklace of shells and gold around Cortés's neck. Cortés responded by offering him a cheap necklace of coloured glass and metal. 2 empires, 2 gifts, 2 completely different meanings. To Moctezuma, it was ceremony, mutual respect. To Cortés, it was submission. As the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan, they were struck speechless. The streets were clean, wide and paved. The canals glittered with boats carrying fruit, flowers and music. Every bridge and courtyard felt like a painting. Bernal Diaz, one of Cortés's men, wrote later, "When we beheld so many cities and villages built on the water, we were amazed. Some said it was like enchantment, others that it was a dream." Temples rose into the clouds, palaces shimmered with mosaic tiles, and in the great market of Tlatelolco, tens of thousands traded in perfect order. Europe had never seen anything like it. Moctezuma offered the Spaniards one of his own palaces to stay in, vast, beautiful, surrounded by gardens and fountains. Servants brought them food, gifts and flowers. At first the visitors were polite. They admired the art, the architecture, the order. But soon their eyes began to wander, counting, measuring, planning. They asked how many people lived in the city, how deep the lake was, where the gold came from, and always they asked about the temples, the great pyramids where the gods were fed. Moctezuma answered carefully, but every word seemed to make the strangers' curiosity grow darker. For a few days peace held. Cortés and his men explored, escorted by guards who smiled politely but never blinked. They watched ceremonies, listened to chants, tasted chocolate mixed with honey and spice. But beneath the surface, tension grew. The people of Tenochtitlan began to whisper. The emperor was too kind, they said. He was treating these strangers as gods when they were clearly men, and men who stared too long at the city's treasures. Even Moctezuma's councillors began to worry, but the emperor refused to act. He believed destiny was unfolding, and no one could fight fate. At night, Cortés walked through the palace gardens, listening to the strange songs drifting from the temples. The air was thick with flowers, but he couldn't smell them anymore. He saw the city lights reflecting on the lake and thought of Spain, of glory, titles, and letters to the king. He thought of the gold he'd seen, not as art, but as currency. He began to see Tenochtitlan not as a miracle, but as a vault waiting to be opened. And perhaps, in that moment, he realized something Moctezuma never did. This city, this empire could fall. Then came the omens again. Thunder without rain, dogs howling through the night, a strange mist rising from the lake. The people whispered that the gods were angry, that the guests were not divine, but cursed. In the streets, some avoided the Spaniards. Others followed them silently, eyes sharp, waiting. Cortés felt it too, the shift in air. He started keeping guards awake at night. He ordered his cannons loaded just in case. It was a fragile peace built on gold dust and misunderstanding, and yet for a few fleeting nights, both worlds existed together. The Spaniards prayed in one courtyard. The Aztec priests sang in another. Canoes glided under the moon, carrying offerings of flowers and fruit. Somewhere, a child laughed by the canal. Somewhere else, a soldier whispered a prayer before sleep. Two civilizations, side by side. Both thinking they understood the other, both terribly wrong. The drums of Tenochtitlan slow to a heartbeat. In the palace, candles flicker against walls covered in gold. Cortés sits awake, staring at the ceiling. Moctezuma dreams of fire on the lake. Soon those dreams will come true. Because hospitality has a limit, and trust once cracked is sharper than any blade. Next time the peace shatters, the palace becomes a prison, and the heart of the empire begins to tremble. You ever have guests who stay too long? At first it's fine. You share stories, pour drinks, laugh together. But then, they stop leaving. They move in. They start rearranging the furniture. That's exactly what happened in Tenochtitlan. What began as hospitality had turned into something else, a quiet occupation wrapped in polite smiles. And the emperor who ruled an empire soon found himself trapped inside his own palace. This is the story of Moctezuma's gilded cage. At first, nobody wanted to believe it. The emperor, still dressed in gold and feathers, still giving orders. Surely he was still in control. But outside the palace walls, the city was changing. The Iron Men had settled in like shadows that wouldn't fade. They walked through the markets, studying everything, touching everything. They watched the temples, they counted the soldiers, and people began to whisper, "Why does our emperor let them stay? Why do they eat our food and walk our streets while our guards stand silent?" The laughter that once filled the city started to fade. The lake, once peaceful, seemed to ripple with unease. Inside the palace, Cortés was smiling. That careful, patient smile that hides 1,000 plans. He already knew what he wanted. Control. And he had realized something dangerous. Moctezuma trusted him. It wasn't a warm trust, but a fearful one. The emperor saw destiny in Cortés. Cortés saw opportunity in Moctezuma. They spoke often, through translators, through charm, through half-truths. Cortés flattered him, praised his city, admired his wealth, and every compliment was a quiet chain. Because when the moment came, Cortés didn't ask permission. He took the emperor prisoner. No one saw it coming. Cortés invited Moctezuma to visit the Spanish quarters, just for a short talk, a friendly meeting. But once the emperor stepped inside, the doors closed behind him, not with a slam but with a sigh. Outside, the guards waited. Inside, the Iron Men quietly surrounded him. They told him he was safe. They told him he was still emperor. They told him it was only temporary, until misunderstandings were cleared up. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The ruler of the Aztec world was now a captive in his own palace. Cortés treated Moctezuma well, or at least that's what the Spaniards said later. He wasn't locked in a dungeon. He was surrounded by luxury, music, food, servants. But freedom, that was gone. Guards stood at every door. Every message that left the palace was read. Every visitor watched. Moctezuma still gave orders, but now they carried less weight. His nobles bowed when they saw him, but when they left the room, they spat on the floor. There's something crueler than violence, and that's humiliation, and Moctezuma was living it, one polite day at a time. Outside, the people began to seethe. They saw their emperor paraded like a puppet, giving speeches written by foreign tongues. They saw their gods insulted, their temples defiled, their pride traded for peace. When Cortés ordered the idols in the temples torn down and replaced with crosses, the city nearly exploded. Priests wept. Warriors clenched their fists. And for the first time in his reign, Moctezuma looked powerless. He tried to calm them, spoke to the crowds from his balcony, asking for patience, for obedience, for faith. But the people turned their faces away. Some threw stones. Their emperor was no longer the voice of the gods. He was the echo of a lost one. Meanwhile, Cortés was walking on a knife's edge. He had conquered a city without a battle, but he was surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people who hated him. His men were restless, scared. His allies, the Tlaxcalans, eyed every corner like trapped wolves. He tried to act calm, but he knew one wrong move could turn Tenochtitlan into a tomb. And then, word reached him that a Spanish force had landed on the coast, sent by his own country to arrest him. Yes, even while holding an emperor captive, Cortés was technically a wanted man. You can almost hear the universe laughing. Cortés decided to leave the city to deal with the new threat, taking part of his army. Before leaving, he placed a man named Alvarado in command. He gave him one simple order: keep the peace. Now, Alvarado wasn't known for patience, and in a city already simmering with tension, he made the worst decision imaginable. During a festival, a sacred ceremony honouring the gods, he and his soldiers attacked. Hundreds of unarmed dancers, nobles and priests were slaughtered inside the temple courtyard. Blood ran down the steps of the pyramids. The drum stopped mid-beat, and outside the city screamed. When Cortés returned, the dream of peaceful rule was over. Tenochtitlan was boiling with rage. Stones rained from rooftops. Bridges were blocked. The air smelled of smoke and vengeance. Cortés tried to calm them. He pushed Moctezuma, his prisoner, his ally, to speak to his people again. The emperor stepped onto the balcony, wearing his finest robe, and raised his hand. He tried to speak, to tell them to be calm, to obey. But this time the people didn't bow. They shouted back. They cursed him. And then someone threw a stone. It struck him in the head. The emperor of the Aztecs fell. Some say the Spaniards killed him later, afraid he'd turn on them. Others say he died from that wound, heartbroken and humiliated. Either way, the man who had once ruled an empire was gone, and with him, the last fragile thread of peace. Outside, the lake turned red with sunset. Inside the palace, the torches flickered against silent walls. The Spaniards gathered what gold they could carry. The city gathered for war. The drums of the gods began again. Faster, louder, furious. And that night, Tenochtitlan fought back. Next time we enter the storm, the massacre, the escape, and the night when the gods took their revenge. Every city has a night it never forgets. For Tenochtitlan, that night came with rain. The sky cracked open, the lake rose, and through the flooded causeways a desperate army tried to flee, burdened with gold that would soon pull them to the bottom of the water. This was La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. It began with betrayal and blood. After Moctezuma's death, the city erupted. The patience, the fear, the uneasy peace, all gone. From the temples came the sound of drums, faster and faster, like a heartbeat turning into thunder. Torches lit the sky red. Every rooftop became a fortress, every canal a trap. The people of Tenochtitlan, once silent, now roared like gods awakened. And at the centre of it all stood Cortés, cornered, surrounded, and terrified. The Spanish garrison holed up in Moctezuma's palace found themselves under attack from all sides. Stones, arrows, spears. A storm of vengeance. Cortés tried to hold the line, shouting orders over the chaos. But every hour the city pushed closer. Every door cracked, every wall trembled. Inside, the air stank of gunpowder and fear. Outside, chants echoed through the rain. The gods are with us. Drive them into the lake. By nightfall, the Spaniards knew the truth. They couldn't hold. They had to flee. Cortés gathered his men in the torchlit courtyard. Their armour dripped with rain, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. He told them they would escape that night, across the western causeway. They would carry the gold they could. They would move silently, and they would pray the gods were too busy watching the storm to notice them. But greed doesn't know when to rest. Some soldiers filled their armour with stolen treasure, gold discs, jewels, bracelets. As if the weight of their greed could somehow make them rich enough to survive, it would soon drag them to their graves. Just past midnight, under sheets of rain, they began to move. Hundreds of Spaniards, thousands of native allies, marching through darkness across the narrow causeway that led out of the city. The water shimmered with moonlight, broken only by the ripples of canoes in the distance. Watchers they could not see. At first it was silent. Then came the first cry, a voice from the darkness, followed by a horn, then a drum. And the night exploded. From every side, canoes surged out of the shadows. Arrows rained down. The air filled with screams, thunder, and the hiss of the lake. The causeway, slick with rain and blood, became chaos. Men slipped, fell, vanished beneath the water. Horses reared and plunged into the dark. The gold they carried pulled them down. Heavy, glittering anchors dragging them into silence. The Aztecs attacked from every angle. Warriors diving from canoes, climbing onto the bridge, pulling men off their feet and into the lake. The Spaniards fired blindly into the dark. Each flash of gunpowder lit faces, terrified, furious, doomed. By dawn the lake was quiet again. Bodies floated among shattered shields and broken spears. The causeway was littered with armour, weapons and treasure that gleamed faintly in the rising light. They say the water itself turned gold that morning, reflecting the sunrise and the greed that had brought it all crashing down. Only a few hundred survived. Cortés was among them, wounded, soaked and silent. He climbed to a tree on the far shore, sat down beneath it, and wept. And that's how history remembers him, the conqueror crying in the rain, beneath a grey dawn, as the city he thought he'd tamed roared behind him. Inside Tenochtitlan, the people rejoiced. The temples rang with victory drums. The gods had been avenged. Warriors brought back armour and banners taken from the dead. The lake gave up its gift: gold, steel, bodies. But amid the celebration there was something else: grief. Because even in victory the cost was high. The temples were stained, the canals clogged with the fallen. And the prophecy, the one about strangers from the east bringing ruin, still lingered like smoke. They had won the night, but the war was far from over. Far away, on a hillside above the valley, Cortés regrouped. He counted what remained of his men. Half gone. Most of the horses, dead. The treasure lost beneath the lake. He looked back toward the city, still shrouded in morning mist, and whispered to his captains, "This is not the end." Because for all his pain, for all his loss, he still had one weapon left: patience. He would return. He would rebuild. And the next time he came, he wouldn't leave until the city burned. But for that one night, for that traiton, for that single sorrowful night, the Mexica had triumphed. The rain finally stopped. The lake stilled, and the survivors on both sides looked up at the same dawn, one of relief, the other of regret. The gold sank deeper into the mud, the cries faded, and the city, though wounded, stood tall once more. But fate doesn't rest. While Tenochtitlan celebrated, Cortés gathered his allies. The silence that followed the night of sorrows was not peace. It was the pause before vengeance. Next time, the conqueror returns, and the city of the lake begins to drown. You'd think after a night like that, a man would give up. Most people would. After all, Cortés had lost half his army, most of his gold, and nearly his mind. But the thing about conquerors is, they never know when to quit. The rain had stopped, the dead had sunk, and the lake lay silent again. But far from Tenochtitlan, in the hills of Tlaxcala, something dark was rebuilding. Cortés was alive, and he was coming back. When the survivors of the Night of Sorrows reached Tlaxcala, they were barely human, wounded, starving, limping through mud and heartbreak. The Tlaxcalans, their uneasy allies, watched them arrive with a mix of pity and grim satisfaction. These were the Iron Men who had promised invincibility, now dragging themselves in defeat. But Cortés wasn't broken. He was planning. Within days, he reorganized the survivors, cleaned wounds, rebuilt weapons. He sent messengers to other tribes, not begging but persuading. He told them that the Mexica's empire was weakening, that the gods had turned against them. And the amazing thing, they believed him, because even in defeat, Cortés had the one thing every empire fears most: momentum. While Tenochtitlan mourned and rebuilt, Cortés gathered men, allies, horses, gunpowder. He forged new weapons, repaired his armour, and sent word to the coast. Spanish ships had arrived. More men, more guns, more hunger. Soon the hills of Tlaxcala echoed with drills and the clang of steel. The same native cities that once bowed to Tenochtitlan now raised their banners under a foreign flag. Cortés promised them freedom. What he really offered was survival, because by now it was clear. Only one side would leave this story standing. Months passed, and then the Spanish army, now larger than before, began its march back toward the Valley of Mexico. The villages along the way emptied before them. Some surrendered, some resisted, and were wiped away. From the mountaintops of smoke rose like omens. The drums of Tenochtitlan answered from across the water. Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's young successor, had taken command. He was no mystic like his uncle. He was a warrior, and he had sworn that if the city was to fall, it would drown in its own blood first. When the Spaniards reached the lake again, they came prepared. They brought ships. Yes, ships. Cortés had ordered his men to build 13 brigantines, small sailing vessels armed with cannons. They were built inland, piece by piece, then carried across the mountains to the water. Imagine that sight. Lines of soldiers and porters dragging the skeletons of ships through the forests, their sails bundled like ghosts waiting to breathe. When they reached the lake and assembled them, the Aztecs must have stared in disbelief. Boats on their sacred waters, carrying fire. The siege of Tenochtitlan had begun. Day by day, the Spanish ships circled the city like vultures. They cut off the causeways, blocked canoes, destroyed bridges. Cannon fire echoed across the water, shaking temples, collapsing homes. Inside the city, famine spread. The canals filled with corpses. Disease followed. The once lush gardens withered into mud. And yet, they fought on. Every night, Cuauhtémoc's warriors repaired the broken bridges, ambushed ships, raided enemy camps. The Mexica refused to kneel. But courage cannot feed an army, and slowly the city began to starve. By now even the Spaniards were sick. Sick from the smell, from the water, from the endless cries in the night. Cortés moved through his camp like a ghost, half admiring the city's defiance, half hating it for not dying fast enough. He sent envoys into the city, offering peace if they surrendered. Cuauhtémoc sent them back, without their hands. Every morning new fires burned. Every night new prayers were whispered to gods who had grown silent. It wasn't just a siege, it was a slow unmaking of the world. By August 1521, the city was almost gone, the temples shattered, the palaces gutted, the lake choked with debris and bodies. Cortés ordered one last assault, a full storming of what was left of Tenochtitlan. House by house, street by street, the Spaniards and their allies fought through mud and fire. The air was thick with ash and screams, and somewhere among the ruins, Cuauhtémoc stood tall, his armour dented, his face streaked with soot, still fighting, still defiant. He knew it was over, but he would not surrender. Not yet. On August 13th, 1521, the last emperor of the Aztecs tried to flee across the lake in a canoe. Spanish brigantines spotted him, surrounded him, dragged him aboard. When they brought him before Cortés, he looked the conqueror in the eye and said, "I have done all I could for my people. Kill me now, if you truly have a brave heart." Cortés didn't. He spared him, for now. But his mercy would prove as cruel as his war. The city fell, the temples burned, and the lake Comonzamora, once a mirror of the sun, turned black with ash. Cortés walked through the ruins silent. He had conquered the greatest city in the New World and found nothing but ghosts. But the story isn't over, because even in defeat, the Mexica would not disappear. And their last emperor still had a final act left to play. Next time, the story of a captive, a confession, and the ember of dignity that even conquest could not extinguish. Every empire has its sunset. For the Aztecs it came quietly, not with trumpets or thunder, but with the slow sinking of light over a broken lake. The smoke had settled, the air was still, and Tenochtitlan, once the shining city of water and stone, lay in silence. The war was over. The conquerors stood among the ruins, and the last emperor of the Mexica, Cuauhtémoc, was a prisoner. When the fighting finally stopped, the city wasn't so much conquered as erased. Temples collapsed. The canals were clogged with rubble. The air reeked of ash and death. But beneath the devastation, life still flickered. A few survivors gathered in doorways, clutching what little they had. A bowl, a blanket, a child. They looked up at the sky, still red from the fires, and wondered what would happen when the sun set again. In the distance, the sound of a single drum echoed. Not in defiance, but in mourning. They found him trying to escape across the lake. The young emperor, fierce even in defeat, captured, soaked, exhausted, but unbowed. When he was brought before Cortés, he stood straight, his chin high. He didn't beg, he didn't plead. He simply said, "I have done all I could for my people. Now finish what you came to do. Take my life." But Cortés, perhaps out of pride or admiration, refused. He needed Cuauhtémoc alive, to legitimize his victory, to parade before the world as proof that even kings could kneel. So the emperor lived, but not as a ruler. In the weeks that followed, the Spaniards began their work. Not of rebuilding, but of stripping. Temples were torn down. Stones were repurposed for new walls. The lake was dredged for gold. The survivors were forced to dig through the ruins of their own city, searching for treasure they'd once offered to their gods. Every idol melted, every jewel stolen. And yet, even as the Spaniards filled their chests, they couldn't find enough. Gold has a funny way of disappearing when you try to count it. Cortés became convinced that Cuauhtémoc was hiding more. He wanted the rest. He wanted it all. They tied Cuauhtémoc's hands and feet. They brought in coals burning hot and placed them beneath his skin. They asked where the gold was hidden. He said nothing. Beside him, one of his generals screamed and begged for mercy. Cuauhtémoc turned his head and said quietly, "Am I lying on a bed of roses?" And then he went silent again. That's courage. Not the kind sung by bards, but the kind that sits still in pain, refusing to give your enemy the satisfaction of a sound. Even Cortés, for all his hardness, eventually looked away. By now the old order was gone. The gods were silent, their temples shattered. The nobles were dead or slaves. The markets were empty. The city that had once seemed eternal, the Venice of the New World, was now a skeleton of its former self. And yet, in that silence, something strange lingered. A stubborn pulse. Not of life maybe, but of memory. The Aztecs had lost their city, their emperor, their world, but not their identity. That would survive quietly, in the language, in the stories, in the songs whispered at night. Songs. Cortés should have been triumphant. He had done what no man had before him, conquered a nation of millions with a few hundred men. But in victory, he found only emptiness. The gold never matched the legends. The land was harder to rule than it was to conquer. And the guilt, though he'd never admit it, began to follow him like a shadow. Some nights they said he walked the ruins of Tenochtitlan alone, listening to the wind whisper through broken arches, the sound of water dripping where once a city had thrived. If he ever heard voices in that wind, maybe they weren't ghosts. Maybe they were memories refusing to die. As the months passed, the lake slowly swallowed the ruins. The canals filled with mud. The stones sank. The flowers never returned. But the sunsets stayed beautiful. Every evening the sky turned gold and crimson over the valley. And somewhere beneath that light, under the ashes and earth, lay the heart of Tenochtitlan, still beating softly, still remembering. If you visit Mexico City today, you walk above it. The stones of the cathedral were carved from the same temples that once touched the heavens, and beneath the pavement the lake still breathes. The empire had fallen, but the story wasn't finished, because Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, still lived, a captive dragged across jungles and rivers, still carrying the pride of a world that refused to be erased. Next time, we follow him on that final journey, the last emperor of the Aztecs and the quiet dignity of a man who faced the end without fear. The war was over, the city was gone. And the last emperor of the Aztecs, Cuauhtémoc, was a prisoner of the very men who had torn his world apart. But he did not bow. He did not beg. And though his crown was gone, his dignity remained, brighter in some ways than gold. This is the story of the captive emperor. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the survivors were rounded up. Warriors, priests, mothers, children. They were forced to walk among the ruins, stepping over the bodies of those they'd loved. The air smelled of smoke, salt and sorrow. Cuauhtémoc was among them, silent, proud, refusing to meet the eyes of his captors. He walked barefoot through the ashes of his city, past the temples that had once kissed the sky. The Spaniards watched him, half in awe, half in fear. Because even in defeat he carried himself like a king. Cortés decided to keep him close, the conqueror and the captive, bound together, not by chains but by fate. They left the valley and headed south, through forests and mountains toward new lands rumoured to hold even greater riches. Gold. Always gold. The song that never stopped playing in the heart of empire. For months they travelled. Soldiers, porters, horses, and the broken remnants of an empire walking beside them. Cuauhtémoc said little. When he did speak, it was measured, dignified, sharp enough to make even Cortés uneasy. Some nights, when the fires burned low, the Spaniards swore they heard him praying in the old tongue, not for revenge, but for memory, for his people not to forget who they were. Cortés had won everything, and yet he felt hollow. Each new victory only reminded him of the cost. His men were restless, his allies suspicious, his king far away across the sea. And everywhere he went, Cuauhtémoc's presence haunted him, a quiet reminder that no gold could buy absolution. He wrote letters to Spain, describing himself as a loyal servant of the crown. But history remembers him walking ahead of a prisoner who never looked at his feet. Because in the end, it wasn't the conqueror who looked noble, it was the conquered. In 1524, Cortés launched a new expedition, deep into the jungles of Central America, chasing rumours of gold in the land of the Itza Maya. The journey was brutal. Rain that never stopped, mud that swallowed boots and horses, diseases that turned strong men into ghosts. The army starved. Men began to whisper that the gold was cursed, that the gods of the jungle were laughing at them. And through it all, Cuauhtémoc marched at the front, silent and steady, like a spirit leading them deeper into the earth. Some Spaniards began to fear him again. They said his eyes glowed in the firelight, that his calmness meant he was waiting, for a sign or for vengeance. Cortés's paranoia grew. He was convinced Cuauhtémoc was plotting against him, that the emperor was secretly rallying the native porters, planning to rise up and kill the Spaniards in their sleep. There was no proof, only fear. But fear, as history loves to show us, doesn't need evidence, just imagination. So Cortés ordered his arrest. Once again the emperor was bound. Once again he stood before the man who had taken everything from him. On a humid February morning, Cuauhtémoc was sentenced to death. No trial, no ceremony. Just the jungle, the sun, and the man who had once ruled the Valley of Mexico. As they prepared the noose, he turned to Cortés and spoke for the last time. "I have done what was my duty to my people and my gods. Now you will do what your heart commands." And with that he walked calmly to his death. No fear, no pleading, just silence, like the moment before a storm breaks. When it was over, the jungle swallowed the sound. The soldiers looked away. Even Cortés, hardened as he was, couldn't meet his men's eyes. They buried Cuauhtémoc beneath a sabre tree. No crown, no tomb, no ceremony. But the people who followed whispered his name as they passed. They didn't call him emperor anymore. They called him Tlatoani, the speaker, because even in death, his voice spoke louder than his conquerors. Years later, when Cortés returned to Spain, he was a wealthy man, but never a peaceful one. He had titles, land, fame. But something had gone missing along the way, something that gold couldn't replace. They say he was haunted by dreams of the lake, by the face of the emperor staring back at him through the smoke. Maybe guilt, maybe memory, maybe both. He died far from the land he'd conquered, alone, restless, and uncelebrated, while the name Cuauhtémoc became legend. And so the last true emperor of the Aztecs fell, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet of a foreign jungle. Yet, even as his body faded into the earth, his story did not. Because cities can burn and empires can drown, but dignity has a way of surviving. Next time we return to the ruins, to the city beneath another, and to the strange rebirth that rose from the ashes of conquest. Cities never truly die. They sink, they fade, they change their names. But they always find a way to keep breathing. Tenochtitlan was gone, its temples torn down, its canals filled, its gods silenced. But if you stand today in the heart of Mexico City, beneath the car horns and the church bells, you can still hear it, the heartbeat beneath your feet. This is the story of the city beneath another. After the fall, Cortés ordered the ruins cleared. Stones from temples were reused to build cathedrals, palaces became barracks, and the streets, once crossed by canals, were filled and flattened to make roads for horses and carts. A city built on top of a city, like a conqueror stepping on a crown. It was called La Ciudad de Mexico, the City of Mexico, the first European capital in the New World. But no matter how deep they buried the old gods, they never stayed quiet for long. Everywhere the Spaniards built, the past found ways to surface. In the foundations of churches, workers uncovered carved idols, their faces eroded but their eyes still fierce. At night, some said they could hear drums echoing faintly under the earth. Others swore the ground itself hummed during storms, as if the lake still remembered what it once held. The priests dismissed these as pagan tales, but the locals knew better. They whispered, "Tenochtitlan still lives. It sleeps beneath the streets." The new capital grew quickly. Spanish mansions rose beside native huts. Church bells replaced the temple drums, and Latin prayers echoed over the same plazas where sacrifices once kept the sun alive. But life didn't disappear. It adapted. The descendants of the Mexica became masons, carpenters, scribes. Their old knowledge, their architecture, their language, it all quietly bled into the new order. Even the water refused to vanish. No matter how much they drained and paved, the lake always returned, reminding everyone that this was still a floating city, still Tenochtitlan at heart. In secret, some of the old priests began writing, not prayers but memories. They painted codices, books of skin and paper, telling the story of their people before the world forgot. They drew the gods, the emperors, the battles, the beauty and the loss. Some were hidden away, others destroyed when found. But a few survived, carried by hands that refused to let history vanish. Those painted pages became the last voice of a silenced world, whispering across centuries to say, "We were here." Cortés himself ordered a great cathedral to be built over the Templo Mayor, the very heart of the old city, where generations had once offered blood to feed the sun. Stone by stone, the temple was erased, its foundations turned into a church floor. But you can't erase a memory that deep. Centuries later, when archaeologists dug under the cathedral, they found it. The serpent carvings, the old staircases, the bones of sacrifices still sleeping in the soil. It was like opening a wound that had never healed. Every era added another layer. Spanish rule gave way to revolution. Revolution gave way to a nation. And that nation grew into one of the largest cities on earth. Skyscrapers rose where canoes once floated. Subway tunnels cut through ancient causeways. And still, every time someone digs too deep, they find Tenochtitlan waiting. A piece of pottery, a wall of volcanic stone, a mask staring up from the dirt. The past doesn't vanish. It waits. The descendants of the Mexica never forgot who they were. They kept their language, Nahuatl, their music, their dances, their stories. Every November, candles flicker in homes for Dia de los Muertos. Marigolds line the streets, and families welcome their dead with food and song. It's not just remembrance, it's a quiet act of defiance, a way of saying, we're still here. Even the word Mexico carries their memory. It comes from Mexico, the old name of Tenochtitlan itself. The empire may have fallen, but its heart still beats in every syllable. They say Mexico City still moves. The ground sinks slowly each year, as if the ghost of the lake beneath it is breathing in its sleep. Some buildings lean, others crack, but the city endures. Half Spanish, half Aztec, and entirely human. And maybe that's fitting, because history isn't just what we build, it's what refuses to be buried. The city of water became the city of stone, and the city of stone became the city of glass and light. But beneath it all, the roots of Tenochtitlan still stretch out, whispering through the soil, waiting for the world to listen again. Next time, we'll listen closer to the stories, songs, and languages that survived the conquest, the gods that would not die, and the people who carried their fire through the darkness. You can destroy temples, you can burn books, you can melt idols into coins, but you can't kill belief. When the Spaniards built their churches over Aztec pyramids, they thought they were silencing the gods forever. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. The gods didn't die, they just changed their names. After the conquest, the new rulers brought their faith, a single God, a saviour on a cross, a heaven above and a hell below. The old gods, the sun, the rain, the feathered serpent, were declared demons. Worship was banned, the old rituals forbidden. But faith doesn't disappear when you outlaw it. It hides, it adapts. In villages and markets, people began to pray quietly, blending the new saints with the old spirits. The rain god Tlaloc became San Isidro, patron of farmers. The mother goddess Tonantzin, giver of life and love, became the Virgin of Guadalupe. And the people still bowed their heads at dawn, still offered flowers, still whispered ancient names behind Christian hymns. The story goes that in 1531, a man named Juan Diego, a native convert to Christianity, saw a glowing woman appear on a hill near Mexico City. She spoke to him in Nahuatl, the old language of the Aztecs, and told him to build a church in her honour. When he showed her image to the bishop, they called her La Virgen de Guadalupe. But to the native people, she looked familiar. A brown-skinned mother, radiant with light, standing on the moon, surrounded by stars. To them, she wasn't new. She was Tonantzin, returned under a different name. Even as churches rose across the land, old traditions continued quietly in the shadows. Farmers still offered maize to the earth before planting. Families still burned incense for the dead. And in the hills, at night, you could sometimes hear drums, faint, steady, echoing from places no roads reached. The priests called it superstition, but to the people, it was survival. The gods had simply learned to whisper instead of shout. The Spaniards took away temples, but they couldn't take away stories. In villages, elders told the old myths around the fire, of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who brought wisdom and art to humankind, of Huitzilopochtli, who chased away the darkness each dawn, of Coatlicue, the mother who gave birth to the stars. The stories changed shape like smoke, sometimes dressed in Christian words, sometimes in dreams, but always alive. Because stories are the easiest thing to hide, and the hardest thing to kill. Even in their new churches, the people found ways to honour the past. They carved old symbols into the corners of altars. They painted suns behind saints, serpents in the borders of holy books. 1,000 little acts of rebellion, hidden in plain sight. The murals of angels looked suspiciously like warriors. The crosses bloomed with flowers that once belonged to the old gods. Every piece of art was a code, a promise that the past would never truly vanish. Language became the bridge between worlds. The conquerors taught Spanish, but Nahuatl refused to die. It remained in markets, in songs, in everyday speech. Even now in Mexico, the words chocolate, tomato, coyote, avocado all come from Nahuatl. Every time someone says them, a piece of Tenochtitlan speaks again. Language carries memory better than stone. It moves through time quietly, untouched by conquest. Every year when the rains end and the corn is harvested, families gather to welcome their dead home. Candles flicker, incense drifts, marigold petals form golden paths to the door. The Spaniards once tried to stop it, calling it pagan, but they failed. Because Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, isn't about worship or fear. It's about love. It's the belief that death is not the end, but a journey. And that those we lose never really leave. Sound familiar? The old gods would approve. 500 years later, Mexico is a tapestry woven from two worlds, the conqueror and the conquered, the cross and the serpent, the song and the silence. And through it all, the old spirit endures. You can see it in the art, in the rhythm of the language, in the festivals that light up the night. The gods of the Mexica aren't gone, they live in colour, in music, in memory. Every time a drum beats, every time incense burns, every time someone whispers gracias or tlazocamati, thank you in Nahuatl, they rise again. They rise. The gods didn't die, they just changed their clothes. And maybe that's what survival really is. Not resistance, but transformation. Next time we return to the present, to walk once more along the lake that remembers, in the city that grew from its waters, and listen for the echo that still hums beneath the streets. Cities change, empires fall, but the earth remembers. Tonight we return, not to Tenochtitlan, not to New Spain, but to the city that stands above them both, Modern Mexico City. Alive, restless, shining. At first glance, there's no trace of the past. No pyramids. No lake. Just buildings, roads and light. But listen closely, and you'll hear it. The echo beneath the noise. The whisper of water under stone. It's night. The streets of Mexico City hum with life. Food stalls, laughter, distant music. But beneath your feet, under layers of concrete and centuries, the foundations of Tenochtitlan still hold. If you walk down Avenida Madero, past the glowing storefronts and the smell of roasted corn, you're walking along the old causeway, the same road that once led straight across the lake to the heart of a city built on water. The lake may be buried, but the ground still sinks a little each year, like it's remembering what it used to be. In the Zocalo of the great central square, two worlds still stand side by side. On one side, the cathedral, massive, solemn, built from the stones of Aztec temples. Its bells ring deep and slow, echoing across the plaza. And just behind it, beneath glass and lights, the ruins of the Templo Mayor rise from the earth, the very heart of Tenochtitlan, uncovered stone by stone. Tourists take photos, scholars measure carvings, but if you close your eyes, you can almost see it whole again. Priests in feathered cloaks, smoke rising to the sky, the sound of drums rolling across the lake. Two faiths, two cities, one heartbeat still pulsing beneath the stone. Sometimes when it rains, and in this city it always rains, the streets flood for a few hours. Cars stall, people curse, the city groans. But maybe, just maybe, it's not a failure of plumbing. Maybe it's the lake reminding everyone it's still there, just waiting below the surface. At night, when the rain pools in the plazas, you can see reflections of light trembling in the water, and for a moment it feels like the city of the lake has returned, a ghost shimmering in the glass of the modern world. The people here still carry the memory, not in temples, but in language, music and ritual. Street vendors call out in Nahuatl words without knowing their origin. Artists paint suns and serpents without realizing who they honor. And every November, the city blooms in marigolds for the Day of the Dead, a festival older than the churches that now bless it. Life, death, and memory, still bound together like they were 5 centuries ago. Because some stories don't end, they just change their rhythm. Beneath the asphalt and skyscrapers, the old lake still moves. Engineers measure it, scientists worry about it. But to the locals, it's alive. The city breathes with the rhythm of the water below. Buildings tilt slightly. Churches lean. The earth sighs in its sleep. And if you stand quietly in the early morning, before the traffic wakes, you can feel it. A faint hum beneath your shoes, the pulse of the valley, the heartbeat of a drowned world that refuses to die. It's strange, isn't it? We build cities, empires, nations. We think they'll last forever, but time turns everything to dust, and dust becomes the foundation of something new. The stones of Tenochtitlan became the churches of Mexico. The words of the Aztecs became the language of millions. The gods became saints. The rituals became culture. And through it all, the people kept living, loving, singing, carrying both past and present in the same heartbeat. If you listen closely, truly listen, you can almost hear the city whisper. The rush of cars becomes the whisper of canoes. The rumble of trains becomes the thunder of drums. And the flicker of neon lights becomes the shimmer of torches on the water. History isn't behind us, it's beneath us. Layered, breathing, waiting for us to remember. And maybe in those moments just before dawn, the gods of the lake look up through the cracks and smile to see their city still alive. Tenochtitlan was called the city born from water, and even after 5 centuries of stone and smoke, it's still a city born from memory. The Aztecs believed that as long as people remembered their ancestors, they never truly died. Maybe that's why the lake still breathes, why the ground still shifts, why the stories still echo in every street. Because Tenochtitlan isn't gone, it's just sleeping beneath the modern world, a dream that never stopped dreaming itself. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the city as it once was. Moonlight over the canals, temples gleaming like stars, and the soft sound of paddles breaking the water. The empire is gone, the conquerors are gone, but the story remains. And the lake remembers everything.